In 1347, a philosopher in Paris lit a fire and burned every page he had ever written before the whole university. No executioner touched him. He did it with his own hands. A year earlier, the Pope had already condemned his ideas as heresy. Today, 10 medieval scholars who dared to challenge the Church and paid in silence, exile, or fire. What does it take to make the Church erase a man completely? Let's go. Number 10. Nicholas of Autrecourt. The man at the center of this story was not a firebrand by temperament. He was born in Lorraine around the year 1298, and by his 30s, he had made his way to the University of Paris, the most prestigious school of theology in Europe, the place where a career in the Church was either made or quietly ended. And the idea he built his life around sounds, at first, almost too small to be worth anyone's anger. He did not believe we can ever be certain that one thing causes another. Take the ordinary version of it. You put a log into a fire. The log turns to ash. Everyone agrees the fire did that. But stop and ask what you actually witnessed, and the honest answer gets uncomfortable fast. You saw a log. You saw flames. You saw ash. You never once saw the causing itself, that invisible link between the first thing and the second. You inferred it because you have seen the same sequence 1,000 times and your mind closes the gap on its own. Nicholas pushed on that gap and refused to let it close. Certainty, he argued, belongs only to what cannot be denied without contradiction. Everything else, the whole chain of cause and effect that holds the visible world together, is inference. In a modern seminar room, that is a fascinating position to defend over coffee. In 14th century Paris, it was something else. Nearly every serious argument of the age was built the same way. Start from the world you can see, follow the causes upward, arrive at conclusions nobody was permitted to doubt. Nicholas was not attacking the conclusions. He was quietly pointing out that the ladder everyone climbed to reach them was not nailed to anything. That is a far more dangerous sort of criticism, because there is no single heresy to name in it. He was not denying a doctrine. He was asking whether the method that produced it could deliver proof at all. Historians of philosophy have a nickname for him, the medieval Hume, after the Scottish skeptic who made almost the same argument about cause and effect some 400 years later. It is worth handling carefully. The resemblance is real. The influence is not. There is no evidence the later argument grew out of this one, and the scholars who work on both treat the overlap as coincidence rather than inheritance. By the middle of the 1340s, the wrong people were reading him. In 1346, he was called south to Avignon, to the papal court, and what survives of it is a shape rather than a detail, a humiliation staged inside a cardinal's palace. Which cardinal, the record does not reliably tell us, and we are not going to invent a name to fill that hole. What matters is that it happened first. Whatever was said in that room, he walked out knowing roughly how the rest would go.
Yep.
The formal blow landed on the 19th of May, 1346. Pope Clement the Sixth condemned his teaching as heretical. Not a warning, not a request for clarification, an official finding from the very top of the Church. In Paris, that verdict carried a particular weight. The university lived inside the Church's authority and drew its licenses from it, and a master condemned in Avignon was a master with nowhere left to stand. Then came the slow part. It took more than a year for the machinery to finish turning. On the 20th of November, 1347, the masters of the University of Paris assembled in the Church of St. Mathurin, and the papal letters were read out to them, aloud, in full. Picture that room, the entire senior faculty of the leading university in Europe, sitting in rows, listening to a document from Avignon that named one of their own and everything he had written. Nobody was debating. There was nothing left to debate. The reading was the point. The whole institution had to hear it together. 5 days later, on the 25th of November, the second half of the sentence was carried out in the Dominican church in Paris. He stood in front of them and took it all back. the 4 condemned propositions, and the articles of a letter of his that opens with the words Ve mihi, woe is me. Then he did the part people still remember. A fire had been prepared. He picked up the articles, and most probably the treatise that went with them, the one called Exigit Ordo Executionis, and he put them into the flames himself. Not an officer of the court, not an executioner. His own hands, his own pages, in front of the assembled university. Here is the detail worth sitting with. He had spent his working life arguing that you can never actually observe one thing making another thing happen, that the link is always inferred and never seen. And then he was placed in a church and made to become that link in person. Everyone there watched a cause and its effect with perfect clarity. The man reached out, the pages caught, the work ended. The one connection in his entire philosophy that nobody present could possibly doubt was the one where he destroyed his own life's work with his own arms. How much of his writing actually went into that fire, we cannot say with confidence. The sources name the articles and point to the treatise, and then they stop. He lived on for roughly another 20 years and died around 1369, but the working life of a Paris master ended the moment the pages caught. What makes the case unusual is not the condemnation. Condemnations were common enough. You will hear 9 more before this list is finished. It is that he stayed and carried out the sentence on himself, in person, in a building full of the people he had worked beside for years. Not everyone made that choice. In those very same decades, another logician was circling the same territory from the other side. Not whether causes can be known, but how few assumptions an explanation is allowed to carry before it stops explaining anything. His summons came too. He answered it, went where he was told to go, and then waited years for a judgment that simply never arrived. And when the ground finally shifted under him, he did not walk into a church and light anything. He waited until dark and he left. Number 9. William of Ockham. He gave the world a razor, not a blade, but a rule. Don't multiply explanations beyond what you need. Strip away the unnecessary. Keep only what the evidence demands. It's the kind of idea that still shapes science and philosophy 7 centuries later, quoted in classrooms that have never heard of the man who first shaped it into a weapon of logic. And in 1324, that same razor got its author summoned to Avignon to explain himself. The man behind it was an English friar, a Franciscan trained at Oxford, sharp enough to unsettle people who preferred their theology tidy and their doctrine unquestioned. The unsettling started with one man in particular, John Lutterell, the former Chancellor of Oxford, who accused him of unorthodox teaching on the nature of the Eucharist. Lutterell didn't just complain quietly in a common room. He carried the accusation all the way to the papal court itself, and by 1324, Ockham found himself summoned south, to Avignon, to answer for his ideas in person. Avignon in the 1320s was not a place you wanted to be under suspicion. It was the seat of papal power, close watched, politically charged, full of clerks and cardinals with long memories. A commission was formed to examine his writings line by line, proposition by proposition, led by a theologian named Durand of St. Pourçon, a rival thinker with every incentive to find fault. For 2 years, from 1324 to 1326, that commission worked through Ockham's philosophy, hunting for error in every clause. When it finished, it flagged 51 propositions worth censure. 51 separate points, marked as suspect enough to warrant official disapproval. And yet no formal condemnation of heresy ever came down. Not in 1326 when the commission closed its work. Not for 2 more years after that. Ockham sat in Avignon, technically free, technically uncondemned, but effectively trapped in a slow-moving process with no clear end and no acquittal in sight. Imagine waiting years for a verdict that simply never arrives, not cleared, not convicted, just suspended. Watching your reputation, erode a little more with every passing month. Then the ground shifted under him for an entirely different reason. A dispute broke out inside his own order, a fight over apostolic poverty, over whether Christ and the apostles had owned property, a question that sounds abstract until you realize the Pope himself, John the 22nd, had staked his authority on one side of it. The head of the Franciscans, Michael of Cesena, took the opposite position, and Ockham, already under a cloud in Avignon, chose to stand with Michael against the Pope. That decision turned a slow theological inquiry into something far more dangerous. On the night of May 26, 1328, Occam and Michael of Cesena didn't wait around to see how the argument would end. They left Avignon in the dark, quietly, without permission, slipping past a court that had spent 4 years deciding what to do with them, and put as much distance as they could between themselves and the papal city before anyone noticed they were gone. No public hearing, no last appeal, just 2 men on the road at night betting everything on distance. Here's the detail worth sitting with. 11 days later, on June 6, 1328, Occam was formally excommunicated. Not for the 51 flagged propositions, not for any doctrine on the Eucharist or on universals or on the nature of knowledge. He was excommunicated for leaving for the flight itself, not for what he'd written. The man who spent his career insisting that explanations should never be more complicated than necessary had been cut off from the church over the simplest possible charge there was. He ran. He didn't run to obscurity. He ran to the one place in Europe with the power and the motive to protect him, the court of Louis of Bavaria, the Holy Roman Emperor who happened to be locked in his own power struggle with the very Pope Occam had just defied. It was a logical shelter, almost elegant in its simplicity. The emperor's enemy was the philosopher's accuser. From that point on, Occam lived and worked far from Rome, far from Avignon, his case never resolved, his name never cleared, his book still circulating under the shadow of that unresolved sentence, copied and read by scholars who never learned whether their author was innocent or guilty. He died in Munich in 1347, having spent nearly 2 decades in that unresolved state, not condemned outright, not forgiven either, simply outside the fold. No reconciliation with the papacy ever came before the end. The inventor of a principle built on cutting through unnecessary complexity spent the second half of his life tangled inside one of the messiest, most unresolved standoffs of the entire medieval church. It's a strange kind of ending for a man remembered for clarity. But Occam wasn't the first brilliant mind the church left in that kind of limbo, and he wasn't even the first to run from a verdict that had, in effect, already been written before he ever walked into the room. 200 years before Occam slipped out of Avignon in the dark, another philosopher faced something worse. He was made to burn his own work with his own hands, and then, years later, silenced for good by an official decree with no appeal left to file. His name was Peter Abelard. Number 8. Peter Abelard. 20 years before that final blow landed, he had already learned exactly how little his own arguments would matter once the church decided the verdict in advance. He was, by any measure, one of the sharpest minds of his century, a philosopher and teacher based in Paris, whose method was almost radical in its simplicity. Take contradictory quotations from respected authorities, lay them side by side, and let the reader work out the tension for themselves rather than hand them a tidy answer. He called the approach sic et non, yes and no. It assumed people were capable of thinking things through on their own. That assumption did not sit well with everyone who held power over what could and couldn't be said out loud. In 1121, at a council in Soissons, that tension caught up with him for the first time. He'd written a treatise on the Trinity, the Theologia Summi Boni, and it drew hostile attention fast. He wasn't simply criticized from a distance. He was made to walk to a fire in front of witnesses and throw the book into it himself, not have it seized by an officer, not have it banned by a written decree from somewhere far away. He had to do it with his own hands, watch the pages curl and blacken, while the men who'd forced the moment stood and watched him do it. You might expect a man who lived through that kind of public humiliation to spend the rest of his life keeping his head down. Abelard didn't. He kept teaching, kept writing, kept building the very reputation that had made him dangerous in the first place. And 20 years later, in 1141, the argument caught up with him again, this time for good. This round, Abelard actually walked into it on his own terms, or at least thought he did. He challenged his chief opponent, Bernard of Clairvaux, to a public debate at the Council of Sens, expecting a real exchange of ideas, a genuine chance to defend his positions in the open, in front of an audience capable of judging the arguments on their merits. What he found when he arrived was nothing like a debate. A commission on heresy was already assembled, already prepared, with quotations pulled straight from his own books lined up and ready to be read aloud, one after another, as evidence stacked against him. There was no exchange planned. There was no genuine hearing scheduled. The verdict, in every practical sense, had already been reached before Abelard ever opened his mouth to speak in his own defense. He understood what was happening fast enough to do something about it. He refused to play along with a script written before he arrived. Rather than stand there and answer accusations in a proceeding rigged before it began, he turned and walked out of the hall, and appealed directly to the Pope in Rome, hoping for a fairer hearing somewhere above the heads of his accusers. It didn't save him. The council pressed on without him and condemned a cluster of his propositions anyway, on the Trinity, on the nature of Christ, on grace, on the role of intention in judging right and wrong. Exactly how many propositions were condemned depends on which account you read. Some sources put the number around 19, others count closer to 13 or 14. Historians still don't fully agree on the exact tally, and the sources themselves pull in different directions on it. What both versions agree on, though, is what came next. On July 16, 1141, Pope Innocent II issued a papal bull confirming the condemnation, and then went a step further than a simple condemnation required. He didn't just excommunicate Abelard. He imposed what the documents themselves call perpetuum silentium, perpetual silence, not a temporary censure with a review date, not a period of penance that eventually lifted, but a formal, permanent legal prohibition on ever publicly teaching or writing on those questions again, for the rest of his life. A pope, in ink and sealed wax, ordering one of the era's great minds to stop thinking out loud forever, with no clause for appeal. Abelard didn't fight it from exile or spend his final months raging against the verdict. He made his way to the Abbey of Cluny, where the abbot there worked quietly to broker some kind of peace between him and Bernard of Clairvaux, the very man who'd led the charge against him at Sens. It brought Abelard a measure of calm in his final stretch of life, but not a full restoration of the name he'd spent decades building. He died at Cluny in April 1142, still carrying the weight of that bull, his reputation never fully repaired within his own lifetime. Twice in 20 years, this was a man made to answer for his own ideas in front of judges who had already decided the outcome before he walked in. First with a fire he had to light with his own hands, then with a decree that tried to reach past the moment and silence him for the rest of his days. But even a permanent bull like that one only works on someone who's still alive to feel its weight. The Church would eventually go further still, reaching back centuries after a thinker had already died, digging up work the world had left quietly alone for hundreds of years, and condemning it anyway, when there was no one left standing who could even walk out of the room in protest. That's where the story goes next, with a philosopher named John Scotus Eriugena. Number 7. John Scotus Eriugena. He was one of the boldest minds of the early medieval world, an Irish scholar who crossed the sea to end up translating Greek theology at the court of a Frankish king. Picture him in a candle-lit scriptorium around the year 867, hunched over stretched vellum, quills scratching out sentence after sentence of a sprawling work called Periphyseon. Outside, the court of Charles the Bald hums with its usual business, nobles, clerics, the ordinary noise of a royal household going about its day. Inside that quiet room, one man is patiently building an argument that will outlive him by centuries, and eventually get him condemned twice, long after he's no longer around to speak for himself. Eriugena wasn't some obscure hermit scribbling in secret, hiding his ideas from suspicious eyes. He was respected, even favored, moving comfortably in royal circles in Francia, trusted enough to translate difficult Greek texts for a king's own court. During his own lifetime in the 9th century, his ideas were treated as broadly acceptable theology, the kind of learned speculation that impressed rather than alarmed his peers. Periphyseon explored the nature of God and creation with a kind of philosophical daring that few churchmen of his era dared attempt, weaving Greek thought into Latin argument line by careful line, page after page, year after year of quiet labor. Nobody hauled him before a council. Nobody demanded he take back a single word of it. He wrote, he taught, and by around the year 877 he was gone, leaving his book behind on the shelves and in the libraries of Europe, quietly copied by later hands, and passed along from one generation of readers to the next, largely undisturbed for a very long time. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. More than 3 centuries later, in 1225, the Council of Sens took up Periphyseon and condemned it outright. Pope Honorius III didn't just object to a few troublesome lines buried deep in the argument. He ordered the entire book burned, and he described it in language that still stings on the page all these centuries later, a text swarming with worms of heretical perversity. Sit with that image for a second. Worms, perversity, swarming, hurled at a philosophical treatise written 35 decades earlier by a man who'd been dead just as long, unable to answer a single charge against him, or explain what he'd actually meant by any of it. Copies were gathered up from monastery shelves across the region and destroyed. The very ideas that had once passed quietly as respectable theology were suddenly treated as something contaminated, something that needed fire to purify from the record entirely, as if the ink itself carried some kind of infection that had to be burned out for good. Picture the scene at Sens itself. Churchmen gathered in solemn rows, a condemned manuscript held up before them like evidence at a trial, and then the flames taking hold of pages that had survived quietly for 3.5 centuries without incident. No one in that room had ever met the man who wrote the words now curling into ash in front of them. They were judging a stranger, a name from a distant century, based entirely on sentences he could no longer explain, soften, or clarify to anyone's satisfaction, whatever his original intentions had truly been. Here's the detail that makes this whole story strange rather than simply sad. The church couldn't touch the author himself. There was no Eriugena left to drag in front of the council, no trembling scholar to threaten with excommunication, no living voice in the room to argue back or beg for mercy, or explain his reasoning one more time. He'd been dead for roughly 13 generations by the time Honorius III's condemnation finally landed on Periphyseon, so the punishment fell entirely on the book itself, on ink and parchment standing in for a man long since turned to dust in some forgotten grave. Pages went into the flames instead of a person. It was execution by proxy, carried out on stacked vellum because the man who'd actually written it was centuries beyond anyone's reach, beyond even the church's considerable power to punish or forgive at that late date. In an age when the church held enormous power over the living, the power to excommunicate, to imprison, to burn a person at the stake, Eriugena's case shows the limits of that power turned inside out. Death had placed him somewhere the councils couldn't follow, and so they followed his words instead, generation after generation, refusing to let a dangerous idea simply fade quietly into the past unchallenged. And then, astonishingly, it happened again. In 1585, Pope Gregory XIII revisited Periphyseon and condemned it a second time, still troubled by the pantheistic currents running through its arguments about God and nature blurring together into one another, until the boundary between creator and creation seemed to vanish entirely from view. Two separate popes, nearly 400 years apart, both independently decided the very same 9th century manuscript was dangerous enough to need burning all over again. A book that had circulated quietly among churchmen for generations kept getting rediscovered as a threat, judged again and again by readers who'd never met its author and never could hope to. Centuries removed from the candle-lit room, where it was first written by a scholar who thought he was simply doing careful, faithful theology. That's the real twist buried in this story. Eriugena himself never faced a single trial. He never recanted a word, never stood accused before a council, never had the chance to defend one sentence he'd written at that quiet desk in Francia. The men who condemned him weren't punishing a living heretic sitting across from them, weren't watching him sweat under questioning. They were punishing a ghost, using his own ink against him centuries, after his hand had stopped moving across the page for good. If Eriugena was judged only after death, spared at least the terror of facing his accusers face to face, the next scholar on this list got no such mercy at all. He was dragged back again and again to answer for his beliefs while he was very much alive and breathing, 5 separate times over 30 years. Each recantation quietly undone the moment he walked free from the council chamber and returned to his own quiet thoughts. His name was Berengar of Tours. Number 6. Berengar of Tours. He was a theologian from Tours whose disagreement with the church over one specific idea, what actually happens to the bread and wine on the altar, turned into a grinding 3-decade ordeal that no single book burning could ever match for sheer stubborn persistence. Picture him standing before a packed council chamber, gray-haired, worn thin by years of this, signing a statement he doesn't believe a word of, knowing full well he'll be back here again within a few years to sign another one just like it, in front of the same watching faces. Berengar taught that the Eucharist worked symbolically rather than through a literal physical transformation of bread and wine into flesh and blood. That single position put him on a collision course with Rome that started in 1050 and simply didn't let up for 30 relentless years. At the Easter Synod that year, Pope Leo IX excommunicated him in absentia. Berengar wasn't even present in the room to hear the verdict handed down against him from far away, in a place he'd never even traveled to himself. Later that same year, at the Council of Vercelli, church authorities staged a public burning of books connected to his teaching, smoke rising over a crowd gathered to watch heresy get purged from the record in front of their own eyes. There's a strange footnote buried in the smoke of that particular bonfire. The treatise thrown into the flames as Berengar's had actually been written by Retramnus, misattributed in the heat of the controversy to John Scotus Eriugena rather than to Berengar himself. Nobody at Vercelli seemed too concerned about getting the authorship straight before lighting the fire. The point that day was the burning itself, not the footnote nobody bothered to check before striking the match. Berengar recanted in 1050. He recanted again in 1055. Each time, he'd sign whatever statement was placed in front of him, walk away from the council chastened and humiliated, and then quietly slide back toward his original position once the pressure eased and the watching eyes moved elsewhere, back to his own students and his own private convictions. It became a pattern that repeated itself across an entire generation of his life: condemnation, forced recantation, a private return to belief. And then, inevitably, it would all start over again from the beginning, as though nothing had ever truly been settled at all between him and Rome. Year after year, the same cycle turned, and each time a Berengar walked back into a council chamber, he knew exactly what was coming, and he walked in anyway. The most vivid moment came in 1059 at the Lateran Council in Rome. Under pressure from Cardinal Humbert, a Berengar was made to sign an oath describing the Eucharist in the most bluntly physical terms imaginable. The bread and wine, the document stated, are crushed by the teeth of the faithful, not symbolically, not spiritually, physically ground down between actual teeth, in the actual mouths of actual worshippers kneeling at the altar rail on any ordinary Sunday morning. It's about as graphic as medieval theology ever gets, and a Berengar put his own name to it under duress, in front of watching witnesses, inside a room deliberately built to make refusal simply impossible for a man standing alone against an entire council of his enemies. Read those words again, and imagine hearing them read aloud in Latin, echoing off stone walls, while the man forced to agree with them stood in silence. You'd think a confession that explicit would settle the matter for good, once and for all, no arguments left to make. It didn't. Between 1076 and 1080, he recanted yet again, proving the 1059 oath had never actually changed a single thing he truly believed deep down. It had only bought him a few more years of uneasy quiet before the next confrontation caught up with him once more. Even Lanfranc, once a fellow scholar who'd shared common intellectual ground with him in earlier, friendlier years, ended up his fiercest opponent, later rising all the way to Archbishop of Canterbury, while helping build the very case against his old colleague and friend, turning shared history into ammunition against him. Then, in February of 1079, back at the Lateran once more, Pope Gregory VII, a man who had once shown a Berengar something close to genuine protection in earlier disputes between the two of them, required him to sign yet another formula, a softened version of the earlier language but still an unambiguous statement of transubstantiation. Even his own former patron, sitting on the throne of St. Peter, couldn't let the matter rest for good in the end. That's 5 separate recantations spread across 30 punishing years, 1050, 1055, 1059, the 1076 to 1080 period, and finally 1079. 5 times forced to publicly abandon his own convictions in front of watching councils, 5 times humiliated in exactly the same manner, in exactly the same kind of room. 5 times he quietly found his way back to them anyway, in private, away from Rome, and its endless summons back to the same chamber. That's the real shock buried inside a Berengar's long story. The 1059 oath was about as extreme a capitulation as the medieval church ever managed to extract from a living scholar, teeth grinding down bread and wine. No room left for symbolism at all, and it still didn't break him in the end. Where a single burned manuscript could silence a dead man's ideas for a while, no oath, no matter how humiliating, could reach far enough into a living man's mind to change what he actually thought once he was alone again. The cycle of judgment and recantation simply started over again, and again, for 3 decades straight, wearing him down physically without ever fully winning the argument or silencing what he actually thought in private, behind closed doors, far from watching councils. A Berengar was worn down again and again while he was still breathing, dragged back to Rome time after time to answer for the same stubborn ideas he refused to truly abandon no matter how many oaths he signed under pressure. The next scholar on this list wouldn't even get that grim privilege of facing his judges in person. The Inquisition kept building its case against him after he was already lying in the grave, handing down a verdict to a corpse. His name was Pietro d'Abingen. Number 5. Pietro d'Abingen. He was a physician and philosopher from Padua, and the Inquisition brought him to court not once, but twice in his own lifetime. Picture a courtroom heavy with candle smoke. Robed judges lean forward in the shadows. An old scholar stands alone, defending himself with logic and medical texts instead of prayers. Pietro d'Abano was born around 1257 in Padua, Italy. Padua was a university city, a place built on argument and inquiry. Students came from across Europe to study there. It was also a dangerous place to think too freely, and every teacher there knew it well. Pietro built his reputation on medicine, not on magic or rumor. He wrote a massive book called Conciliator Differentiarum. In it, he tried to reconcile Arab medicine with Greek medicine. Two great traditions, often in conflict, folded into one coherent system built on reason. Physicians studied his work for generations afterward, long past his own death. This was not the work of a charlatan. It was the disciplined work of a serious mind, the kind of book that shaped how doctors themselves were trained for centuries to come. But medicine wasn't his only interest. He was drawn to astrology. He was drawn to natural philosophy, the study of the hidden forces behind the visible world. Many physicians of his era leaned on the stars to time treatments and diagnose illness. In Pietro's own mind, these were sciences, tools for understanding nature, no different from anatomy or herbal medicine. In the eyes of the Church, that kind of curiosity looked like something else entirely. It looked like a door left open for the devil to walk through, one thread at a time. The Inquisition of Padua put him on trial a first time. He stood before the judges. He answered the charges as calmly as a physician diagnosing a patient, and he walked free, acquitted, his reputation apparently intact. You'd think that would be the end of it. It wasn't, not even close. A second trial followed years later, and this time the mood in the courtroom was different, colder, more suspicious of everything he had written. The accusations sound almost like folklore rather than law. Prosecutors claimed Pietro used the help of the devil in his daily life. They said that spent coins magically returned to his purse, drawn back by demonic trickery. They claimed he possessed the philosopher's stone, the legendary substance alchemists chased for centuries, said to turn ordinary metal into gold and grant its owner power over nature itself. To hold that stone, in the eyes of the court, was to have made a bargain with something unholy. Here's the detail that sticks. Pietro never lived to hear the verdict. He died in prison in the year 1316, an old man in a cold cell, waiting on judges who never came back with an answer. The case was still open when he died. The judges hadn't even decided his fate one way or the other. That should have ended the matter completely. A dead man can't be punished. A dead man can't be silenced any further than death already silences him. Except the court didn't see it that way at all. The judges reached a verdict anyway, months after there was no longer anyone left alive to hear it. Against a corpse, after the trial should have simply closed on its own the moment he died. They ordered his body dug out of the ground. They ordered it burned in public, as an example to anyone else tempted by forbidden knowledge. As if fire could still hurt a man who no longer felt anything at all. Think about that scene for a moment. A grave opened before a crowd. A body dragged back into daylight after already being laid to rest in peace. Flames lit in the town square for a man who was already far beyond their reach, unable to protest, unable to explain himself one final time. And then, according to legend, the story takes one more strange and dramatic turn. A friend, the tale says, slipped into the prison before the sentence could ever be carried out. He smuggled the body away in secret under cover of night and buried it somewhere no inquisitor would ever find it. When the fire was finally lit in the square, the story goes, it consumed a stuffed effigy instead of a real man. Straw and old cloth, dressed and shaped to look like a corpse. The real body, meanwhile, rested somewhere else entirely, hidden and safe from the flames. It's a haunting image, the kind of story that gets retold for centuries around a fire of its own, growing taller with every telling. A crowd gathered to watch justice done, believing every second of it, while the truth was buried quietly somewhere else, far from prying eyes. A secret kept for good, or so the story insists. But not everyone believes it happened that way. The historian Lynn Thorndike studied the record centuries later, tracing every claim back to its original source. His conclusion was blunt and a little deflating. Much of this saga, the effigy, the secret burial at night, even large portions of both trials themselves, reads like a legend stitched together generations after the fact. Likely invented sometime in the 1400s or 1500s, long after Pietro was dead and in no position to object, with little solid grounding in anything actually written down at the time it supposedly happened. So maybe the truth is quieter and sadder than the legend. A brilliant scholar died alone in a cold cell before judges could even reach a verdict against him, and churchmen, unwilling to let the matter simply rest, punished an empty grave instead of a living man. Either way, one thing stayed true through every version of the story, legend or record. Pietro d'Abino never got the chance to answer for himself, not once, not in either trial. His medical writing outlived every accusation ever made against him. The trial, in the end, did not. If d'Abino was judged after he could no longer speak a single word in his own defense, the next man on this list was condemned by the Pope's own pen while he was still very much alive and walking free, still teaching, still writing. And he didn't respond with silence. He responded by helping crown a rival emperor. He helped install a rival pope of his own. He did it inside Rome itself, in the boldest possible act of open defiance the Church had seen in decades. His name was Marsilius of Padua. Number 4. Marsilius of Padua. He was a philosopher from Padua who dared to argue that political power belongs to the people, not to the papacy. Picture a royal court in exile. A fugitive scholar sits at the emperor's side. Later, a coronation is staged inside Rome itself, an open act of defiance against the very pope who ruled that same city. Marsilius of Padua was born around 1275, in the same restless city that had already produced one condemned scholar on this very list, a place that seemed to breed dangerous thinkers. He studied and taught between two great cities, Padua and Paris, moving in the same intellectual circles as the boldest thinkers of his age. Paris, in particular, was a hotbed of new ideas about law, government, and the limits of church power. It was the perfect place for a mind like his to sharpen its arguments against Rome, surrounded by other scholars asking the same dangerous questions. In 1324, he finished a work that would upend his entire life, a treatise called Defensor Pacis, the Defender of the Peace. In it, Marsilius argued something radical for his time. Legitimate authority, he wrote, comes from the people themselves, not from any pope's claim to worldly power, not from divine right handed down quietly through the church. The people, the community as a whole, deciding for itself who governs and how, and holding the power to remove a ruler who failed to serve that community properly. That single idea was a direct attack on centuries of papal doctrine, on the very foundation of how power was supposed to work across Christian Europe. Popes had spent generations building the idea that their authority reached into worldly kingdoms, not just souls, not just churches. Marsilius took a knife to that entire structure in one carefully argued book. Later generations of political thinkers would return to that same argument again and again, long after Marsilius himself was forgotten by most of Europe. He didn't wait around to see how Rome would react to a book like that. In 1326, before any formal condemnation ever came down, Marsilius packed up and fled. He went straight to the court of Emperor Louis of Bavaria, the Pope's chief political rival, and the one ruler in all of Europe powerful enough to actually shelter a man the Church wanted dealt with for good. That single decision changed everything that followed, and it very likely saved his life in the years to come. He wasn't sitting around waiting to be arrested. He wasn't hoping quietly for mercy from Rome. He got out ahead of the danger entirely, and he chose his protector with real care, a man who had every reason in the world to shelter an enemy of the Pope, a man already locked in his own long struggle with Rome over imperial power. The condemnation arrived anyway, just as he must have expected it would. In the fall of 1327, Pope John the 22nd issued a bull known as Licet Juxta Doctrinam. It formally condemned a handful of propositions drawn straight out of Defensor Passus, picking the treatise apart line by line, doctrine by doctrine, as if the Pope himself needed to answer every argument personally. Marsilius, along with his close ally and fellow scholar Jean of Jandun, was branded with a phrase rarely used in papal language at all. Both men were called arch-heretics, manifest and notorious, in front of the entire Christian world. Their names read aloud as a warning to anyone tempted to follow their thinking down the same road. Think about how deliberate that wording really was. Not simply heretics, a label the Church used often enough by then. Arch-heretics, a label meant to place a man beyond redemption entirely, beyond any hope of ever returning quietly to the fold. It was about as harsh as papal language could possibly get, reserved for the rarest and most dangerous cases. Most scholars who crossed the Church quietly backed down, or simply went silent for the rest of their careers. Marsilius did neither. Here's the detail that sticks. By the time those words were written down and sealed with wax, Marsilius was already gone, already safe, already sitting at the emperor's side, hundreds of miles away from Rome, completely out of the Church's reach, beyond the Pope's soldiers and beyond his courts. And he didn't stop at simply escaping, at simply staying safe and quiet. In 1328, Marsilius helped turn the tables completely, in a way almost no other condemned scholar on this list ever managed to pull off. He took part in formally branding the Pope himself a heretic, flipping the very accusation right back where it had come from, word for word. In the same bold stroke, he backed the installation of a rival pope, a man named Nicholas V, set up in direct opposition to Rome's own long claim of unbroken authority over the whole Church. And he stood in the city of Rome itself, as Louis of Bavaria was crowned Holy Roman Emperor, inside the Pope's own territory, as a calculated and very public act of defiance that nobody in Europe could afford to ignore. Picture that coronation for a moment, staged as much for the Church's benefit as for the crowd watching it. Trumpets echoing through the Roman streets. A crown lowered onto the head of the Pope's sworn enemy in the Pope's own city, with the condemned philosopher standing right there among the architects of it all, a scholar turned kingmaker in the very city that had branded him an arch-heretic. It's hard to imagine a more direct, more theatrical answer to being called an arch-heretic in a papal bull. He never made peace with Rome again, not for a single day of the rest of his life. Marsilius died in 1342, still living at the emperor's court, still formally condemned, still completely unmoved by more than a decade of papal anger directed squarely at him, and at every idea he had ever put to paper. Marsilius was branded an arch-heretic while he could still speak, still write, still defend himself and fight back with real actions of his own, out in the open. The next name on this list wasn't condemned until after his own death. Judged not once but twice, centuries apart, even though he had died at peace with the very Church that would go on to punish him anyway, long after he was already gone and unable to answer. His name was Joachim of Fiore. Number 3. Joachim of Fiore. He was a monk from Calabria, and he believed he had worked out the calendar of God. Picture a stone cell in southern Italy, candlelight flickering on a rough wall. A monk hunched over parchment drawing 3 interlocking circles, not a map of land, a map of time itself. Joachim lived from around 1135 to 1202. He split all of history into 3 great ages: the age of the Father, the age of the Son, the age of the Spirit, each one building on the last, each one closer to something final. This wasn't idle scribbling. Other monks copied his diagrams. Churchmen took his three-age scheme seriously enough to argue with it. And he didn't stop at theory. He did the math. He worked out that the third age, the one that would sweep away the old order of the church, would begin around the year 1260. A real date, written down, waiting. Here's the strange part. While he was alive, the church liked him just fine. Popes approved his monastic order during his own lifetime in writing with formal blessing. Rome had no complaints. He founded houses, he attracted followers, he corresponded with churchmen who respected him. He died in 1202 at peace with the institution he served. No charges, no trial, no scandal at his deathbed. Just an old monk closing his eyes, still convinced his math was correct. You might assume his story was already finished. It wasn't, not even close. 13 years after he was buried in 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council convened in Rome. Bishops from across Christendom gathered to settle doctrine, and on the agenda, a dead monk's writing. Not Joachim himself. He couldn't be tried. He was already gone, 13 years in the ground. Instead, the council condemned one specific treatise he had written while he lived. In it, Joachim had gone after a fellow theologian named Peter Lombard, arguing over how to properly explain the Holy Trinity, a subject that got scholars burned for less. Joachim didn't hold back. He called Lombard a heretic and a madman in writing for the whole church to read. The council looked at that argument and sided against Joachim. Not the other way around. Bishops from across Christendom, sitting in judgment on words written by a man already in his grave for over a decade. So a monk who died in good standing with Rome had his private theological quarrel overturned from beyond the grave. Posthumous judgment, round one. That should have closed the book. It didn't. Fast forward to 1256, more than half a century after Joachim's death. A radical Franciscan named Gerardo da Borgo Sandinino picked up Joachim's writings and ran with them. Gerardo argued the age of the Spirit was arriving any day now, and when it did, it would make the entire church hierarchy obsolete. Popes, bishops, the whole structure of Rome swept aside for something purer, something newer. That was too dangerous for Rome to ignore. A movement openly predicting the end of church authority, spreading among the very friars sworn to obey it. Pope Alexander IV condemned Gerardo outright, and he condemned Joachim's teaching right alongside him, in the same breath, as though the two men were standing side by side in the dock. 54 years after Joachim had died peacefully, his ideas were standing trial without him in the room to explain himself. Here's the detail that sticks. Joachim himself never called for tearing down the church. He was a loyal monk in good standing right up until the day he died. It was his readers, generations later, who turned careful prophecy into open rebellion. And those readers kept coming. Radical Franciscans known as the Spirituals leaned hard on his three-age theory to justify defying their own superiors inside the order, insisting a new and purer age had already begun. Later still, a preacher named Fra Dolcino led an armed uprising, partly fueled by that same apocalyptic arithmetic Joachim had scratched out in his cell, generations earlier, never imagining where it would end up. That arithmetic had a deadline attached to it. Around the year 1260 was supposed to be the hinge of all history, the exact moment the old church order would give way to something new. 1260 came, and 1260 went. No new age arrived. No hierarchy collapsed. Popes kept ruling. Bishops kept their sees. Life went on exactly as before. Just another ordinary year on the calendar, indistinguishable from the ones before it. So people did what believers always do when a prophecy quietly fails to happen. They recalculated. They pushed the date forward, found a new formula, tried again. Some kept pushing that date for centuries afterward, always locating a fresh year that might finally be the one. The math kept changing. The certainty never did. Now think about what actually happened to this man. A monk who spent his entire life inside the church's good graces became, only after his death, a name permanently attached to two separate condemnations. The first was almost personal, a heated fight over the Trinity with a rival scholar. The second was far bigger and far more dangerous. His prophecy had outlived him by half a century, and it was still actively recruiting followers willing to take up arms. He never once stood accused of anything while he was alive to breathe and defend himself. It was his ideas, written on parchment in that quiet Calabrian cell, that kept getting hauled back into ecclesiastical court, again and again, decades apart, long after the man who wrote them could offer a single word of explanation. Silencing a living man is one thing. Threaten him, question him, force him to answer face to face. This was something stranger. Rome spent decades trying to shut down words that had already left their author's hands entirely and taken on a dangerous life of their own, spreading from monastery to monastery like a fire nobody could quite trace back to its spark. Joachim was made to go quiet only after death, his own words turned against him decades too late for him to answer back. Our next name was made to go quiet while she was still very much alive, breathing, arguing, refusing to bend. An 80-year-old nun, an entire convent forbidden to sing, forbidden to hold mass, reduced to whispering behind closed doors. Her name was Hildegard of Bingen. Number 2, Hildegard of Bingen. She was already one of the most famous women in Europe, a visionary, a composer, a healer. Popes wrote to her, kings sought her counsel, and near the end of her long life an archbishop tried to make her go quiet along with every woman under her care. Picture a convent on a hillside above the Rhine. Rupertsberg near Bingen, Germany. Candle-lit halls. Elderly nuns moving quietly between them, their footsteps the only sound. And one of them, white-haired in her 80s, standing in a doorway, refusing to back down from a man who could crush her convent with a single decree. Hildegard was born in 1098. Decades before this conflict ever began, in 1147 and 1148 at the Synod of Trier, Pope Eugenius III personally reviewed her visions. He gave them his approval in front of churchmen from across the region. That kind of endorsement wasn't handed out lightly. She wasn't some obscure mystic scribbling alone in a corner cell. She had papal backing, real authority, a reputation that reached all the way to Rome itself. She wrote Civias, a record of her visions that circulated widely across German-speaking lands. She composed music still performed today, nearly 9 centuries later, unusual for any composer of her era, let alone a woman. She wrote treatises on medicine, on natural history, on the human body, on plants and stones and the workings of the world, work that scholars still study now. By the time she was in her 80s, she was arguably the most respected woman in the entire church, a figure popes had personally vouched for. Then, in 1178, near the very end of her life, a dispute broke out that had nothing to do with theology and everything to do with a grave. A nobleman who had once been excommunicated by the church had been buried in the consecrated ground of Rupertsberg, inside the convent's own cemetery, under the same soil where Hildegard's own sisters expected to be laid to rest one day. Word reached the Archbishop of Mainz, and he gave an order. Dig the man up, remove him from holy soil. An excommunicated body, he said, had no right to rest among the faithful. Hildegard refused outright, flatly, without hesitation, even knowing exactly who she was defying. She insisted the man had received absolution before he died, that he had made his peace with God in his final hours, and that his body belonged exactly where it lay, undisturbed, at peace under consecrated earth. She didn't just send a letter and hope the matter would quietly resolve itself from a distance. She traveled to Mainz in person twice, at nearly 80 years old, over rough medieval roads, to argue her case directly to the archbishop's face. Twice she made that long, exhausting journey. Twice she stood before him and made her argument. Twice she was turned away without satisfaction, sent home with nothing settled. So the archbishop escalated the punishment far beyond the original dispute. He didn't just reprimand Hildegard personally. He placed the entire convent under interdict, a formal sanction that fell on every woman living there. Here's what that actually meant in practice day to day. No mass, no communion, no public worship of any kind for anyone inside those walls. The nuns of Rupertsberg were permitted only to recite the divine office in a whisper, behind closed doors, quietly enough that no outsider passing by could hear them. A community built around song and prayer, around Hildegard's own compositions sung aloud every day, suddenly reduced to near total silence. Think carefully about who this punishment actually landed on. Not just Hildegard alone, the one who had actually defied the archbishop. Every single woman inside that convent, guilty of nothing except living under her roof and following her lead. Voices that had sung her music for years, in the chapel, at every service, morning and night, were told to stop, immediately, indefinitely, with no end date given. The composer of some of the most striking sacred music of her century was banned from letting her own community sing a single note of it out loud, in her own house, under her own roof. The interdict held through the rest of 1178 and on into the following year. Month after month of enforced silence, with no clear promise of when it might end, no timeline, no negotiated release date. An entire religious community stripped of its voice, over the fate of one buried body in one small cemetery on a hillside above the Rhine. It finally lifted in March of 1179, and here's the detail worth sitting with. It ended right around the time the archbishop who had imposed it died, not because Rome stepped in to overrule him, not because Hildegard's arguments finally won the day in any formal, documented sense. The dispute was never actually settled by appeal or negotiation or compromise. It simply ended when the man on the other side of it was no longer alive to keep enforcing his own order. An 80-year-old woman, one of the most celebrated visionaries in all of Europe, spent close to a year of her final months on earth watching her sisters made to whisper their prayers behind locked doors, instead of singing the music she had written for them. All because she refused to let a dead man's grave be disturbed on her word alone, against the direct order of a man who outranked her in every formal sense. She never backed down, not once, through 2 long journeys and nearly a year of enforced silence pressed onto her entire community. She never let the body be dug up. She never apologized for her refusal. She outlasted the man who had punished her and her convent simply by refusing to move. Hildegard and her sisters were made to go silent while they were still alive, their voices taken from them by order of a man who outranked them, but in the end, outlived none of the argument. She died not long after the interdict finally lifted, having spent one of her final years on earth fighting for the simple right of her own community to sing out loud. Our final case is stranger still and darker. A scholar condemned not once but twice, possibly destroyed by his own secretary and cleared in the end not by any pope but by a poet. Last on this list, the strangest name of all, Siger of Brabant. Number 1. Siger of Brabant. He was a master at the University of Paris, and he taught Aristotle the way a Muslim commentator named Averroes had reinterpreted him, a reading that cracked medieval theology wide open. Reason could walk one path, faith could walk another, and Siger was willing to stand in front of students and argue that both paths could be true, each on its own terms, without one having to bow to the other. Historians would later call it the theory of the double truth. At the time, it just sounded like heresy waiting to happen, A young master telling a room full of students that the philosophers might be right about the world even when theology said otherwise, and that both could be spoken aloud in the same university. Picture the lecture hall, torchlight flickering against cold stone, rows of students crowded on wooden benches, breath fogging in the winter air, wax dripping onto half-finished notes. At the front, a young master paces, building an argument piece by piece, working through Aristotle, working through Averroes, pushing into questions about the soul, about the eternity of the world, questions the church would rather nobody asked out loud. Near the back of the room, half in shadow, a bishop is listening, and he is taking notes. That bishop was Etienne Tempier, and over the better part of a decade, he came for Siger of Brabant twice. The first strike landed on December 10th, 1270. Tempier condemned 13 propositions drawn straight out of the teachings of Siger, and the group later remembered as the Latin Averroists in Paris. It was a shot across the bow, a warning that the university's philosophy faculty had wandered somewhere the theology faculty did not want it to go. Siger didn't stop. He kept lecturing, kept writing, kept pushing the same difficult questions. 7 years later, Tempier came back with a far bigger net. On March 7, 1277, he issued a single sweeping decree condemning 219 propositions circulating in the university, and this time, Siger's ideas were caught squarely in the middle of it. That second condemnation did what the first one hadn't. It ended his teaching career in Paris for good. The lecture hall that used to be packed with students went silent. The master, for the moment, did not have a podium left to speak from. But Siger didn't simply disappear into obscurity after that. He was hauled before a tribunal run by the Grand Inquisitor of France, the kind of proceeding that had ended careers, and worse, for far lesser men. And instead of quietly accepting whatever verdict was coming, Siger did something remarkably bold for a man already twice condemned. He appealed his case directly to Rome, carrying his own defense to the highest court in Christendom, betting that the papacy itself might hear him out in a way that Paris no longer would. It was a long, uncertain journey for a man who had already been condemned twice, but it was the only path left open to him. He never got to see how that appeal ended. He wasn't given the chance. Sometime between 1281 and 1284, at the papal court in the Italian town of Orvieto, far from the Paris classrooms where he had built his career, Siger of Brabant died. The exact year isn't settled. The exact cause isn't settled either, and that gap in the record is where the story turns strange. According to a later chronicle from Brabant, Siger was killed by his own secretary, a man the chronicle describes as having lost his mind, who turned on him without warning, by some accounts wielding nothing more than the pen Siger used for writing. Legend has it that the philosopher who had spent his whole career defending the authority of reason was undone in an act of pure unreason by the one person who sat closest to his words every single day. It is a story passed down through a chronicle, not a verdict confirmed by any court. The sources disagree, and no one has ever settled exactly what happened in that room in Orvieto. But it is the kind of detail that lodges itself in the mind and refuses to leave. A scholar condemned twice by a bishop, hunted by an inquisitor, appealing to Rome for the right to keep thinking out loud, and then, if the chronicle is to be believed, cut down by the hand meant to record his ideas, not end them. 2 condemnations from one bishop, a tribunal before the Grand Inquisitor of France, an appeal to Rome that never got its answer, a death in a foreign city wrapped in a chronicle's dark rumor. By any reasonable measure, Siger of Brabant should have ended up a footnote, a name filed away in the record of his own censure and forgotten. Instead, he ended up in paradise, at least in one poet's telling. In the Divine Comedy, in the 10th canto of Paradiso, Dante places the soul of Siger of Brabant among the wise spirits circling in the heaven of the sun, the same ring of light that holds the great theologians and doctors of the Church. and the soul chosen to introduce him, the one who speaks his praise aloud for every reader of the poem to hear, is Thomas Aquinas. The same Thomas Aquinas who, while both men were alive, had written directly against Siger's ideas. In Dante's Heaven, the rival becomes the welcome. Sit with that for a moment. A philosopher condemned twice by a bishop of Paris, hauled before an inquisitor, forced to carry an appeal all the way to Rome just to keep arguing his own case, quite possibly killed by his own secretary in a city that was never his home. And decades later, a poet reaches back, writes him into paradise, and hands the eulogy to the very man who had opposed him in life. It may be the single strangest reversal in the whole history of medieval thought. A condemnation could reach a man's writings. It could reach his career, his safety, even the room where he drew his last breath. It could not reach the version of him that outlived all of it, the version one poet, a generation later, decided was worth saving. And that really is the thread running under every name on this list. The Church rarely needed to kill a thinker outright to win. It found something slower and often more effective. It went after the words themselves. A line condemned here, a lecture hall closed there, a book placed under a bishop's ban, a trial held over a man already in the ground. 10 different lives, 10 different centuries, 10 different methods of trying to make an argument stop moving, and every single time, some fragment of it kept moving anyway, copied by hand, smuggled into someone else's lecture, picked up generations later by a mind that never met the person who first dared to write it down. Sometimes, if you are very lucky, it even gets picked up by a poet who puts you in paradise and lets your old rival say the kind words on your behalf. That is the real lesson hiding inside all 10 of these stories. You can win the argument in your own lifetime and still lose it in the end. If you want more stories about the scholars the Church spent centuries trying to erase, you already know what to do.